The year 1989 began as a time of hope and promise. George H.W. Bush was inaugurated as the 41st President of the United States. The Soviet Army ended a 9-year war in Afghanistan. The first Global Positioning System, or GPS satellite, was launched into orbit. 2 researchers at the University of Utah announced they had successfully achieved a cold fusion reaction in their lab. The new year in Alaska opened with unusually cold and harsh weather, even by wintertime standards in the 49th state. For example, the town of McGrath, located in the Alaskan interior, recorded a low temperature of -75 degrees Fahrenheit and a 10-day high of -58 degrees Fahrenheit. The town of Valdez, located in Prince William Sound and moderated by proximity to ocean waters, escaped the record-low temperatures experienced by much of Alaska, although it had received 220 inches of snowfall in December and January alone. Over 2 feet of snow remained on the ground on the first day of spring, but the temperature was a relatively mild 43 degrees. Dan Lawn lived in Valdez, where he worked for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. Lawn's job was to inspect facility and shipping operations at the terminus of the 800-mile Trans-Alaska Pipeline for the state of Alaska. As far back as 1984, Lawn had observed and reported a troubling pattern of lax oversight and preparedness at the terminal. Among his concerns, the ability to respond to a large oil spill. In the early morning hours of Good Friday, March 24, 1989, U.S. Coast Guard vessel traffic controllers in Valdez received a radio call.
It's Valdez back. We should be on your radar there. We've fetched up hard to ground north of Goose Island off Bly Reef. And evidently leaking some oil.
We're approaching the Exxon Valdez.
Dan Lawn was among the first to be notified that the tanker Exxon Valdez had grounded on Bly Reef.
At the time I got notification of the oil spill, I'd been asleep for 2 or 3 hours. And I got a call from the Valdez Marine Terminal that the ship, the Exxon Valdez, had run aground at Bly Reef and was leaking some oil.
He rowed a pilot boat out to investigate the scene and recorded the first photos and video of the stricken tanker. Arriving on the bridge of the tanker, only a few hours after Captain Joseph Hazelwood's radio call to the Coast Guard Vessel Traffic Control Center, Dan Lawn documented the initial attempts to calculate how much oil had been lost to that point. The result, in a little less than 4 hours, over 6,700,000 gallons had been spilled.
You can see it leaking there by 5 port.
The rate of loss from the ship was nearly 500 gallons of crude oil per second. 8 of 11 cargo tanks and 2 ballast water tanks had been torn open. Ultimately, the Exxon Valdez would leak 11.2 million gallons into the waters of Prince William Sound. While Dan Lawn and the Coast Guard scrambled to assemble and coordinate resources in Valdez, word of the accident spread across the state and throughout the lower 48. In Seattle, the Hazardous Materials Response Branch of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was notified early that first morning by the Coast Guard. This group, known as NOAA Hazmat, was created in the 1970s to provide scientific support and guidance during spills of oil and chemicals in the marine environment. Once characterized in a Seattle newspaper as eco-cowboys, NOAA Hazmat had established a reputation for rapid scientific response to environmental disasters. Following a frenetic morning of mobilization, the first wave of NOAA Hazmat responders departed for Alaska. By 7 p.m. March 24th, the first day of the spill, they were on the ground in Valdez and attending a press briefing with the Coast Guard and other response agencies. Over the next few weeks, NOAA Hazmat provided critical support for the response, detailing where the oil was and using computer models to predict where it would go. On the ground, NOAA team members helped to document initial oiling conditions on the beaches of Prince William Sound as resources were mobilized for what would become the largest oil spill cleanup in history. Just as the scale of the spill and response was unprecedented, so too were the challenges. Prince William Sound was remote and considered to be both a pristine and robust ecosystem that also supported important fisheries. Devising and implementing plans for cleaning oil from contaminated shorelines became complex negotiations among competing and often adversarial interests. The role of NOAA hazmat scientist was to provide a neutral technical basis for the hard choices involved in the cleanup. Inevitably, their advice was not always embraced with open arms. David Kennedy led the NOAA hazmat response team in Alaska.
A spill is a very emotional and draining event. So when you try and talk about the effects in kind of a reasoned, logical way with the science of many years behind it, they have a hard time understanding that. And as a result, that leads to some pretty hard feelings and in many cases, disbelief that what you're talking about and the fact that the science really doesn't prove that the environment will come to an end as they know it is not anything that they're willing or able to accept.
As the weeks and months wore on in 1989, the oil on the shoreline weathered and became increasingly difficult to clean up. As a result, more aggressive techniques were developed and deployed. The use of high-pressure hot water to blast oil from the shoreline became more common. David Kennedy became concerned.
Basically, the beach was being sterilized. I had been working in oil spills for many, many years and had seen a number of examples of where a beach was oiled, and even with a heavy oiling, there were still many things alive on the beach. And as the recovery progressed and some of the oil was removed, those things that were alive on the beach and stayed alive were part of the recolonization of the beach. So as I watched the aggressive steam cleaning taking place and realized that the beaches were being sterilized, I was very concerned that there would be no populations of any kind left on those beaches that would begin that recovery process after the oil was removed.
Dr. Jacqueline Michelle was a key part of the NOAA science team working in Alaska. Trained as a geomorphologist specializing in coastal processes and the behavior of oil on different shorelines, she had studied scores of oil spills worldwide by the time the Exxon Valdez grounding had occurred. But even with this background of experience, she was surprised by the scale of this spill and the disarray of the initial response.
It was total chaos, as always is the case. People were just trying to get set up in space. We're just even something like power for computers or desktop space for laying maps out or phone. I think we felt lucky we got one phone so we could communicate with the outside world. So it was a lot of chaos, but a lot of folks came who had been doing spill response for a while, and so we just started around doing our job. But essentially, there was so much oil, the focus was on water recovery, and then we started gearing up for shoreline cleanup decision making.
Because of her expertise in oil spill fate and effects, Michelle dealt with many of the complex scientific issues that arose. For example, some working on the response felt that seasonal storms at the end of the first year would remove much of the oil from the beaches. So Jackie Michelle monitored shoreline conditions through the winter. Dave Kennedy's concern about the effects of aggressive shoreline cleanup and Jackie Michelle's finding that oil had persisted on the beaches after the first winter led to a more comprehensive NOAA program to document the physical and biological consequences of both oil and cleanup. This new long-term monitoring program integrated oil fate monitoring with biological effects and chemistry studies. For the next decade, NOAA tracked the recovery process in Prince William Sound. Initial findings indicated that the high-pressure hot water treatment on the beaches did indeed result in more biological damage than oil alone, and this conclusion attracted a great deal of attention.
Good evening. Cleanup operations to limit environmental damage from the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska may have made it worse.
Powerful jets of hot seawater sprayed on at least 200 miles of fouled Alaskan shoreline. But the technique may have done more environmental harm than good. That, at least, is the finding of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a leading agency in the cleanup effort.
Over the longer term, however, the monitoring revealed that most plants and animals on oiled beaches, such as seaweeds, barnacles, and snails, recovered after around 4 years. But ongoing studies have shown that pockets of oil remain on some beaches, persisting far longer than many had expected. Continuing research aims to determine just how harmful this old oil might prove to be. NOAA Hazmat used the results of its studies to improve the guidance it provides during oil spill responses. In addition, the rare opportunity to study an area affected by an oil spill over many years has contributed to our understanding of how a complex ecosystem like Prince William Sound's responds to disturbance, especially in the face of other large-scale changes in the marine environment caused by climate change, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and cataclysmic events like tsunamis and hurricanes. Even without major disturbances, the natural environment of Prince William Sound changes rapidly and constantly. In 1990, NOAA ecologist Alan Mearns began photographing the face of a single boulder, later dubbed by his colleagues as Mearns Rock. He has returned to the same place to repeat the same photograph of Mearns Rock year after year for 2 decades, building a series of rocky portraits, much as a parent keeps an album of a child's school photos. These annual portraits show a pattern of great change from year to year, and for oil spill researchers, emphasize how difficult it is to track the waning signal of a spill like the Exxon Valdez against the background of significant environmental variability. In addition to contributing to the science and changing the methods of how we respond to oil spills and how we view recovery from spills and cleanup, the Exxon Valdez fundamentally altered the legal framework surrounding oil spills in the United States. In 1989, only a few weeks before the grounding of the Exxon Valdez on Bligh Reef, a piece of legislation called the Oil Pollution Act had been introduced into the U.S. House of Representatives. The bill had been debated intermittently throughout the 1970s and 1980s, but it had languished in congressional subcommittees with little chance of passage. However, the advent of the Exxon Valdez spill, with its sustained media focus and public outcry, shifted the political dynamic. The Oil Pollution Act sailed through both houses of Congress unanimously and was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush on August 18, 1990. Among its many provisions, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 strengthened requirements for oil spill preparation and planning, increased U.S. Coast Guard response capability, and required double hulls on new oil tankers. The Oil Pollution Act also authorized NOAA to assess and recover damages caused by oil spills, requiring that compensation collected from those responsible be used to restore coastal habitats to viable and productive natural conditions. 20 years later, NOAA's work in spill response and restoration continues. In an average year, the successor to Hazmat, the NOAA Emergency Response Division, provides support and guidance on over 100 different spills. The NOAA Assessment and Restoration Division determines the amount of damage to coastal environments and works with responsible parties to reduce the harm. Through 2008, NOAA had collected nearly $450 million for restoring coastal natural resources. The tragedy of the Exxon Valdez oil spill has ultimately helped to make NOAA a world leader for responding to environmental accidents, conducting natural resource damage assessments, and restoring injured marine resources. But just as the challenges have evolved in the years since the Exxon Valdez spill, they loom large and are changing at an accelerating pace as we move into the future. Melting of polar ice cover due to climatic warming has opened previously inaccessible areas of the Arctic to increased traffic and exploitation, resulting in a greater risk of spills under extreme conditions. Sunken shipwrecks off our coasts with millions of gallons of old fuel and cargo oil are beginning to leak into marine waters. The push to develop alternative energy sources, from biofuels to offshore wind and wave generation, will present new issues and new risks as we strive to make clean energy dreams a reality. 20 years later, the Exxon Valdez spill still means different things to different people, and it endures as a source of controversy, even as it recedes into history.
The Exxon Valdez was an event that in history, most anyone I talk to that was, say, the age of 10 and beyond remembers very distinctly.
There's still oil in Prince William Sound 20 years later, and in some places quite a bit.
It just happened to be the Exxon Valdez. It just happened to be Exxon's ship. It could have been Arco's, it could have been BP's, it could have been anybody's ship. The reason the spill occurred is the system had deteriorated to the point where oversight was lax.
It also was, as a result, a way to focus on where this country was with the oil spill response, look at a number of the issues that were associated with a response, and really do some soul searching because of the visibility, because of the magnitude of the spill, because of the geographic spread of the spill.
There's a lot of interest in sort of revisiting, 20 years later, what have we learned? What still needs to be done, if anything?
I'm starting to see that we're falling back into this complacency that existed before the oil spill.
Dan Lawn lived in Valdez, where he worked for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. Lawn's job was to inspect facility and shipping operations at the terminus of the 800-mile Trans-Alaska Pipeline for the state of Alaska. As far back as 1984, Lawn had observed and reported a troubling pattern of lax oversight and preparedness at the terminal. Among his concerns, the ability to respond to a large oil spill. In the early morning hours of Good Friday, March 24, 1989, U.S. Coast Guard vessel traffic controllers in Valdez received a radio call.
Yeah.
The year 1989 began as a time of hope and promise. George H.W. Bush was inaugurated as the 41st President of the United States. The Soviet Army ended a 9-year war in Afghanistan. The first global positioning system, or GPS satellite, was launched into orbit. 2 researchers at the University of Utah announced they had successfully achieved a cold fusion reaction in their lab. The new year in Alaska opened with unusually cold and harsh weather, even by wintertime standards.
2 or 3 hours. And I got a call from the Valdez Marine Terminal that the ship, the Exxon Valdez, had run aground at Bly Reef and was leaking some oil.
He rowed a pilot boat out to investigate the scene and recorded the first photos and video of the stricken tanker. Arriving on the bridge of the tanker, only a few hours after Captain Joseph Hazelwood's radio call to the Coast Guard Vessel Traffic Control Center, Dan Lawn documented the initial attempts to calculate how much oil had been lost to that point. The result, in a little standards in the 49th state. For example, the town of McGrath, located in the Alaskan interior, recorded a low temperature of minus 75 degrees Fahrenheit and a 10-day high of minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The town of Valdez, located in Prince William Sound and moderated by proximity to ocean waters, escaped the record low temperatures experienced by much of Alaska, although it had received 220 inches of snowfall in December and January alone. Over 2 feet of snow remained on the ground on the first day of spring, but the temperature was a relatively mild 43 degrees.
It's Valdez back. We should be just up hard to ground north of Goose Island off Bly Reef. And evidently leaking some oil, and we're going to be here for a while.
We're approaching the Exxon Valdez.
Dan Lawn was among the first to be notified that the tanker Exxon Valdez had grounded on Bly Reef.
At the time I got notification of the oil spill, I'd been asleep for